Today, we're going to talk about Bitcoin, dubious speculation. If you guys like the content, make sure you subscribe to the channel, give the video a thumbs up. Let's go ahead and jump in. So Bitcoin has pushed up near $48,000. It's currently at $47,000. So we are still keeping the trend intact. We talked about, these 20% drops, 20 to 22% drops. That's what they've all been. And once again, this drop here was only about a 21 to 22% drop. So, it goes to show you that the trend is still intact and that sometimes you still will say, just kidding, when going near the bull market support band. So, and the reason why that's important is because it tends to have implications for later on down the road, right? Again, it could be weeks, it could be months, but it tends to have implications later on. But in the meantime, Bitcoin is pushing close to the yearly high being just below $49,000. So one of the things to take a look at here, if you look at some of these daily moving averages in the context of the bull market support band, you can see that here, I'm just going to remove it here, we got below the 50-day, and then once we got back above it, we then shot back up. And in this case, we actually put in a new local high. And then the same thing over here, right? Once we got above that 50-day SMA, we went right back up. And in this time, in that case, we swept the high. And then here we got above the 50-day, we came back, held it as support, and then we went up again. And so this is why we were focusing a lot on the 50-day and saying, look, if you get a daily close above the 50-day SMA, it sort of favors the idea of going back up, and at the very least, going back to these prior highs. One of these examples went back to the prior highs, and then a couple of the examples actually put in new highs after going below that 50-day SMA. So the trend is still intact, and one of the things we said previously is that by the time you get a larger correction that I know a lot of people would like, it certainly could imply that the trend is over. And same idea that we saw in 2019. Very little corrections, very few corrections, and kept, leaving people wanting more. By the time you actually had a larger correction, buying the dip at that point didn't really work out in the short term, but it still worked out, if you just had the patience to wait another year. So same idea, right? All of these have been pretty shallow corrections at this point. And so by the time you get a larger one, for someone who isn't interested in the short term, like if you're not interested in the short term, it doesn't really matter. But just something to keep in mind, right? Just something to keep in mind. And we also spoke a little bit about, we've talked a lot about the dominance of USDT. You probably thought I was going to say Bitcoin, right? But we've talked some about that, and looking at that trend there. If you look at like the market cap dominance of USDT, we've sort of noted that if it gets rejected here off its 20-week SMA, which we had a whole video on, right? We had a whole video on this, that if this gets rejected by its bull market support band, then what you would look for is potentially for it to tag this trend line eventually. And the reason why this trend line is important is because that is actually, this trend line is ultimately what marked some more, some were market cycle tops, if you want to call them that. Others were just local tops that lasted for, a few months, maybe a year. And so that sort of the magic number on that, if I get the, if I can find it, if I get the price label, about 4%, right? If it takes longer, it could be 4.3%. We're currently at 5.5, but I'm telling you guys, this thing can move, the stablecoin dominance can move quickly. For instance, back in October, it was at 8%, and then 2 weeks later, it had dropped all the way down to 6.7%. So down 1.2 in 2 weeks. It's already down from 6% to 5.5% in 1 week alone. So, if this dropped another 0.5% and came in at 5%, you can see how it's not that far away from the trend line. And so I think that's, something relevant to think about as well. Something else that I wanted to mention is looking at it through the lens of total, right? If you look at the total market cap of crypto, you can see, I mean, if you look at this channel here, I mean, you can pretty clearly see that local top on USD, or sorry, the local bottom on USDT dominance back in that QT bull market in 2019 occurred at the midpoint of the trend line, and we're still not there. I mean, it would still require, and there's no guarantee that we get there. There's also no guarantee that we stop there, but that would put you a little bit higher, right? I mean, not even just a little bit. I mean, that's actually that'd be another 20% move. Now, of course, those things, as much as we would like them to be guaranteed, are not necessarily guaranteed. We've seen other patterns before where, Bitcoin puts in a high, like right here, and then gets a few weeks in a row where it actually sweeps the high. So I don't think we can take necessarily anything to the bank. My point, and I've said this before, is that the way I navigate the market is to just keep my portfolio Bitcoin heavy as opposed to altcoin heavy, because I expect Bitcoin dominance to go up. I expect Bitcoin to absorb that liquidity from the rest of the market. And it certainly continues to do that. Look at alt USD valuations. They look great. All right. I mean, in terms of just today, right? I mean, a lot of them are up a few percent. Now look at Bitcoin valuations. You can see that a lot of them are down. And if you look at collectively alt Bitcoin valuations, you can see that they've now broken below their own bull market support band. And in the last cycle, it was precisely when alts broke down against Bitcoin below the range low that Bitcoin had finally accomplished its goal. And then it actually had a longer cool off period. One of the great things about Bitcoin is how long the volatility can last. But then at some point, the market cools off. And I think that cool off phase could occur after alt Bitcoin pairs have finally broken down. Remember, last cycle, Bitcoin did not cool off until the Bitcoin dominance retraced to the 0.5 retracement from the breakdown point. This cycle, that would correspond to approximately 56%. So I still think there's some things that Bitcoin needs to get done, like breaking ETH Bitcoin down. I think that is likely going to happen as well. It's still at 0.053. And that doesn't mean that it has to break down immediately. It certainly could, but I mean, you can see that a lot of times when it gets in these levels, it takes a long time for it to get back down to the range lows. And at least last cycle, alt Bitcoin pairs broke down before ETH Bitcoin broke down. So I think that would sort of be a telltale sign. If alt Bitcoin pairs break down, then perhaps a few weeks later, we would see ETH Bitcoin break down. But that still could be some time away. And I think for now, we'll see what Bitcoin can do here. If you look at a fib retracement from the highs, so we mentioned that if we can hold here at the 0.5, then eventually there's a good chance we're just going to go right back up to the 618, right? And in fact, that's actually, we don't have to stop at the 618. Let me be clear. In fact, if ETH Bitcoin hasn't broken down by then you can make the case that it won't. But if you look at last cycle, we went up to the 618, we then went all the way back down, to near the 382, then back up to the 618. Here, we went up to the 618. We didn't even make it to the 382. We made it somewhere in between 382 and the 0.5 retracement, and now we've gone right back up. Now, the reason why the bull market support band is important in this context is that normally what you would like to see in uptrends is you would like to see a periodic retest of it, to go check in with it, to make sure it holds out support. And oftentimes we like to do it every 3 to 4 months. Okay, because we haven't gone to it yet, it's now been 16 weeks, right? So we're already at the 4-month mark, more or less. And the issue is that eventually, if we don't retest it soon, then there's a higher probability that by the time we do test it, we could be too far gone to hold it as support. the same thing happened in 2021, right? I mean, like we went far too long. It was 31 weeks, so about twice the amount of time that we're at right now. It was 31 weeks. In 2019, we saw something similar, right? Where we just simply didn't test it for a long time. And after getting above it right here, it took 25 weeks to get back down to it. And at that point, we were just simply too far gone to, to hold it as support. And so I mean, if we were to go back down and test it right now, I think we're still in the window where it could theoretically hold as support because it's still only been about 4 months. And there are examples in the past, I believe, where it took about 4 months between tests. Like right here might be an example. Yeah, about 15 to 16 weeks, right? And then here we left it right there. We tested it. That was about 12 weeks later. But here, when it took 18 weeks, you can see ultimately we did not hold it as support. So we're still arguably in the window, but if the halving narrative takes over, which we said there's a good chance that it will because this market is chasing one narrative to another. If the halving narrative takes over and we see a Bitcoin move into the halving, then by the time you actually test the 20-week SMA, it could be a lot harder to hold it as support. But again, I mean, this is something that we'll likely have to revisit. I mean, if it doesn't come back down anytime, pretty quickly, then we'll have to simply revisit it a few months from now. Because a lot of times what we've seen is, after Bitcoin gets a push back up, it then takes a while for it to bleed back down to the bull market support band. And so, if that happens again, then, the time frame on actually testing the 20-week could be, the 5-month mark, the 6-month mark, the 7th month. I mean, you can see how quickly it could get pretty far out there. If it took as long as 2019 did, then 31 weeks would put you out in May. And I've suggested May as sort of an area of interest a few times because it's after the halving, and so that will sort of be behind us, and it's after theoretically we get the news about whether an ETH spot ETF is approved or not. And so I think that could be the time. And by the way, if you look at this move over here, it started in October and then it eventually broke down in May. Here it started in October, and so you have to wonder, like, is it doing something similar where it stays elevated for too long, and then when it holds the 20-week SMA or tries to hold it at whatever point, perhaps it doesn't actually hold. But again, that could still be some time off. In the meantime, if this just turns out to be a wick or something, like if it turns out to be something like this or like this, then there's still a good chance it would take a while to fade back into the bull market support band. Or if it is doing something like this, right, where it just pops back up to sweep the prior high. The thing that I would look for, honestly, is just keep an eye on alt Bitcoin pairs. Because I think, yes, there's some outside money coming in. There's obviously the spot ETFs, and we've seen the stablecoin market cap go up. But as long as alt Bitcoin pairs haven't broken down, then you could still argue there's that liquidity from the altcoin market that is there to help support Bitcoin. And I know what a lot of people are saying. Well, altcoins are also up today. Yes, they are, but the Bitcoin dominance is up, to 53.5%. So yeah, you have to keep it all, sort of in context of, yes, and we've said this many times, if Bitcoin goes up, it can take the altcoin market with it, right? That's always been the case. It can take the altcoin market with it, but the only way that the altcoin market really goes up is if Bitcoin goes up first. And, for that reason, that's why we focus so much on preserving the Satoshi valuation of your portfolio by having a Bitcoin heavy portfolio. And then again, I'm not trying to suggest that if you want to take on the risk of alts, I'm not trying to say you can't or you shouldn't. It just depends on what your risk tolerance is. I've outlined the reasons that I think a Bitcoin heavy portfolio has made sense over the last 2 years compared to an altcoin heavy portfolio. You either buy it or you don't. At this point, if you haven't been convinced, then you're probably not going to be convinced. And unfortunately, some people will finally become convinced probably assuming we do get close to 60% dominance, by the time they're convinced, it could be very well time for the altcoin market to take back some of that market share. But I mean, timing is everything when it comes to alt Bitcoin valuations. And, I know we went into this year and a lot of people were hopeful that altcoins would sort of take back over, it being the halving year. But since we haven't gone back to looser monetary policy, as we said, and with the halving coming up in April, it seems like we've just shifted right back to Bitcoin, which is something that was always going to be the most likely outcome, given the narrative-driven price action, right? Spot ETF, price rallies into that. ETH merge, ETH Bitcoin rallied into that, like the ETH Bitcoin ratio. Bitcoin halving, right? Same idea. Now, with the merge, ETH USD topped out 1 month before the merge, but ETH Bitcoin topped out on the day of the merge. So we have to keep that in mind as well. And then we also know that at least last cycle, when Bitcoin was rallying in 2019 during a Fed pause, it didn't top out until 1 month before the first rate cut. I don't know when the first rate cut's going to be. To some degree, it's a game of chicken, I think, between Powell and the markets. But right now, the expectation is for a rate cut in May. But just a few months ago, the expectation was for a rate cut in March. And now the March rate cut has almost been completely priced out. So again, it's really hard to say when it's going to happen. I still think it's a game of chicken, more or less, between the markets and the Federal Reserve. So let's see where Bitcoin ends up here. If you go back and look at the 8-week moving average, you can see that we got below it, but we got right back above it the following, we got right back above it a couple weeks later. And this is something that has happened before. There was an example previously where we got below it and then we got right back above it. And there's also examples where we got below it right here, where we then got back above it and then put in a new local high and then came down to the bull market support band, right? And that, let's see how long that took. So that one took about 18 weeks. So that's why I say we're still in the window, right? We're still in the window at 16 weeks, but if we don't test the bull market support band within the next month or so, then I think the likelihood just starts to go up that we won't hold it whenever that test eventually happens. If it happens in February or March, perhaps there's a chance that we hold it. If it doesn't happen until May or something, then the odds go up that we don't. And again, and even then it's not a sure thing, but just looking at prior history, you want to test it every 2 to 3 months, 4 months, max, in order to realistically have go into the test of the 20-week SMA with a lot of confidence. But right now we still haven't tested it. We did get somewhat close. But even then, you'd still like to see it go all the way down there. And this was still a couple % away from the 21-week EMA and even further away from the 20-week SMA, right? 2.5% from the 20-week EMA, 21-week EMA. From the 20-week SMA, it was about a 5% thing. When we rallied into the spot ETF, when we went above the 0.6 risk band, and some people lightened their stack, when we got back down to 39K, I was like, look, guys, if you're light on your Bitcoin portfolio, this might be the only correction that we get for a few weeks, right? Your 20% drop, because that's what every correction has been so far. Doesn't matter if you want it to go down more. That's just what these corrections have been, about a 20 to 21% drop. And sometimes you take what you can get. So those are my views on Bitcoin. I think that the main thing to watch is Bitcoin dominance, which we'll do a video on. Remember, last cycle, Bitcoin, the uptrend was intact until the 0.5 retracement, which was around 56% dominance for this cycle. Last cycle, that corresponded to well over 56% dominance. This cycle, it corresponded to 56% dominance. I also think keep an eye on all Bitcoin valuations. As long as they haven't broken down, then there still is liquidity that's making its way over to Bitcoin, which is still, it has been a tailwind for Bitcoin USD. For altcoins, total 3 minus USDT divided by Bitcoin, look for that 40%. Right now it's at 44%. It's almost at 43%. Okay? Look for that. And then finally, look at ETH Bitcoin, because ETH Bitcoin is also I think needs to eventually break down. And at least historically, the last 2 cycles, it was a Bitcoin rally that broke ETH Bitcoin off of support. And you can see right now, in the context of these rallies, it's breaking a lot of altcoins down. I mean, just look at this. Yes, there's a couple that are up, but even the ones that are up are only barely up, like 0.25% or so or less. The ones that are down, most of them are down 2 or 3%, right? And poor Litecoin is down almost 4%. Link Bitcoin is down 3.5%. BNB, 2.6% down. So I would watch those as long as they haven't yet broken down collectively. There's still that liquidity there, and we'll see. We'll see what Bitcoin can do here, and we'll see how high the dominance can go, and we'll see if we can sweep these highs or do what we did back over here and go a bit higher. So those are my views on the market right now. I honestly can't tell you exactly where it's going to cool off from. What I have said for months now is that when it gets into these moves, you're better off just trying to get out of the way and not constantly try to time things, because oftentimes Bitcoin goes higher than we think, and then oftentimes it goes lower than we think. And again, in 2019, Bitcoin rallied 350% during that QT late business cycle phase. Right now, it's gone up about 216%. So, I mean, at this point, this rally was actually more impressive than this one, but this one has lasted longer. There's a good chance it's also lasted longer because we actually haven't shifted over to looser monetary policy where the market fundamentals have at least last cycle changed. Anyways, we'll go ahead and wrap it up. Thank you guys for tuning in. Make sure you subscribe, give the video a thumbs up. And again,